All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I'm your host Franco. So in 1987, a communal movement founded in Washington D.C. by Marion Petty in the early 1970s that was called the Finders were caught and arrested for abusing children in Tallahassee, Florida. This case was allegedly covered up by the CIA, which then led to wild speculation about the Finders and what they were all about. Were they a harmless cult, or are they a CIA-linked child trafficking group? So there's a lot more to this story that independent journalists have investigated that needs to be discussed. And I'm happy to be joined today by Elizabeth Voss, who's an independent journalist and contributor to Mint Press News, Consortium News, and she's also a co-host of CN Live, and she's a deep investigator of the Finder story. So Elizabeth, thank you very much for being here. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well.
So let's start by expanding on what the Finders are. So who are they exactly, and what were they all about?
Sure. The finders represent themselves a few different ways, and I guess the ultimate conclusion about what they were as a group depends on who you're talking to. But the finders presented themselves as a hippie communal group, as you mentioned, during the 70s, kind of like a relic of the 60s hippie movement. By the 1980s, they had focused more on technology. The members were wearing, business suits and that type of thing, and they had very early access to computers and computing technology that was, again, very advanced for the time. So they were a group that shifted their focus. They described themselves as, taking part in what they referred to as games all over the country and internationally. And they were led by Marion Petty, who was worked in the military for a good 20 years, starting in the 1930s. And while he was working in the military, and again, predating World War II, he was also a part of the kind of what would become the hippie and New Age movement. So his military career really was parallel with his involvement in the hippie kind of subculture. And so I guess, it goes from there. There were some allegations prior to the 1987 incident in Tallahassee, Florida. There was one allegation by a tipster that the group was interested in Satanism, interested in ritually abusing children, and the Washington D.C. Metropolitan Police, decided that there was nothing to that. But from the documents we have available, Detective Jim Bradley did want to look into that further, and the incident in 1987 gave him what he felt was the evidence he needed to get search warrants on Finders' residences. So really, the major information about the Finders that's so controversial comes from the searches of those residences in D.C., to a lesser extent the rural properties in Virginia that the Finders had, and the allegations of what was seen by Special Agent for Customs Ramon Martinez in those residences. Then you have also the allegations that the CIA shut down that initial 87 investigation, which was then discussed and looked into in 1993. After that, the case is basically kind of cold for a good number of years until we have Martinez's customs memos put on the internet. And finally, in 2019, we have the FBI publishing documents to the FBI vault under the Finders subcategory. And those documents kind of complement and comment on Martinez's allegations in some important ways.
So I want to give a warning to the viewers about the next question I'll ask, because they may find the answer to this to be a bit disturbing, since it involves abuse and child abuse. What exactly were the Finders caught doing to children, and how was this described in the press at the time?
Sure. So at the time, I would say that the press initially, in the first few days after the arrests of the two men in Tallahassee, Douglas Ammerman and Michael Holwell, or Houlihan, he had a couple of aliases, when they were arrested and initially linked to the Finders, they were arrested in custody of 6 children who were described as, severely neglected. They were very, very hungry, covered in bug bites, very filthy. And, obviously the police in Tallahassee were concerned that these children were in such poor shape and condition, with 2 men who were not immediately apparent to be their parents and who were very well dressed. It was a very incongruent scene. So, immediately the thoughts in Tallahassee and the police department was, are these children being kidnapped and trafficked? Ultimately, they were found to be the children of Finders members, so they had not been kidnapped, and it wasn't that they were being trafficked without their parents' consent. But the issue of neglect remains. The children said that they were being kept outdoors in DC, even when they were at quote unquote home in the Finders kind of headquarters in DC, that they were not allowed to sleep inside. Those issues of neglect were never addressed and never prosecuted. There were allegations of sexual abuse of two of the children that seemed to be confirmed by medical personnel with the Tallahassee authorities, then were walked back. But what really the more, how do you say, like the issues of abuse of children that we saw separate to the children in Tallahassee were brought up by Ramon Martinez, who wrote about witnessing documents and records in a computer room in DC that described the finders' intent to produce children, traffic children, buy them, kidnap them. That they were keeping basically intelligence files on families in the DC area, that they were applying to be babysitters, that they were working in childcare organizations and that type of thing. So Martinez doesn't state specifically, and he doesn't speculate as to what the finders wanted to do with these children, but he documents their interest in obtaining them, and obviously in some illegal ways. And so a lot of my work on this case has been evaluating whether we can believe Martinez. Is he credible? Is he credible on the count of witnessing documentation of the finders attempting to illegally obtain children? And is he credible when he tells us that the CIA ended this investigation? So that's a lot of what my work has looked at.
And there's evidence that there was more than just 6 children from that Tallahassee case, correct? And how expansive was this across the U.S.? Like, how many states were involved, and about how many children?
Well, 6 children were documented in Tallahassee. We have no way of knowing how many other children were in the custody of the finders. However, Martinez does write in his customs memos that he saw vast quantities of children's clothing, I believe, in the warehouse of the finders that was in DC, and that he saw that the clothing and diapers and that kind of thing looked like they were for children in the range of toddler age to kindergarten, so infancy to kindergarten. He alleges that he witnessed a message broadcast to the finders, advising them on how to move children through different jurisdictions and avoid police detection in the immediate wake of this arrest in Tallahassee. So in addition to that, we know, and the finders admit themselves, that they operated in many different locations, like every place from Hawaii to Panama to China to a lot of different countries. We also have evidence that at least one finders member was given passports to restricted countries during the Cold War that included North Korea, North Vietnam, and the USSR, amongst others. So they were definitely a wide-ranging group. Now, the way that they explain that is to say, well, we were just doing fact-finding exercises, and we were developing our consciousness by showing up in a random town somewhere with no money and then attempting to get $100, and then we'd come back, and that type of thing, which sounds relatively harmless. But what Martinez documents having witnessed is that they had records that were labeled under operations, things like Pentagon break-in, terrorism and explosives, law enforcement evasion, and that type of thing. So the finder's story, as far as the group was concerned at the time, put a very harmless, mundane spin on what seemed, very much to be evidence of criminal activity when it comes to what Martinez says that he witnessed.
So why is this case said to be covered up by the CIA? What is the connection here?
Great question. So basically, the finders were said to have been connected to the CIA in a number of different ways. And one of my articles really tries to look at that in as much depth as is possible with publicly available information. Marion Petty himself, as I mentioned earlier, was a member of the military. He was in the Army and then in the Air Force. His wife, Isabel Petty, worked for the CIA for between 10 and 20 years. And she was, alleged by the CIA to have been simply a staff stenographer. And it's implied that the passports that they found in the DC residences were her passports. But there's a little bit of confusion with that based on redactions and that kind of thing. So it's an open question as to whether those passports were only hers or whether another finders member was given those passports. But in addition to that, Marion Petty either admitted or bragged that his son worked for Air America, which is and was a CIA front company, basically, that was involved in Iran-Contra. In addition to that, you have Sergeant John Stitcher basically stating that the CIA had stepped in or had said that the investigation in '87 into the Finders was stepping on the CIA's toes. There are statements in customs documents that say that basically the CIA was either working with or owned a company called Future Enterprises, where the CIA was taking basically sending agents to be trained in technology and that kind of thing. And there are a number of other relationships between the CIA and the Finders that I go over in my piece. But I think that the strongest is the allegation that the CIA shut down the investigation in '87. Mm-hmm. And we have that from Martinez, who says that it was Sergeant John Stitcher of the Metropolitan Police Department in DC, of the Intelligence Division, who told him that. And unfortunately, we can't have corroboration from Stitcher because he passed away before the 1993 DOJ inquiry. So they couldn't ask him, hey, did you actually say this? Did you write this? But from the other memos and from the other reports that we do have that were authored by Sergeant Stitcher, it does appear that he felt that the CIA had stepped in. One of his reports basically documents a CIA agent who's obviously redacted and unnamed, telling him that something to the effect that it was implied that the CIA had not only been, related to the Finders, had a vested interest in the Finders, but also may have been funding them. So there's a lot there from Stitcher. And then we have a DOJ inquiry that, is a DOJ inquiry only in name. Basically, at the time, the Department of Justice shuttled their investigation and the responsibilities of that investigation down to the FBI. And the FBI then sent that down to the Washington Metro Field Office of the FBI, which had been involved in the original 1987 investigation and was not a neutral third party. So it would be arguable that the results of that investigation are unreliable. And if there was some attempt to essentially render that inquiry, just an act of closing the books on the case, I think that's what the evidence sort of supports as a conclusion. So.
Yeah, it's a little bit coincidental that Stitcher had passed away like right before that was going to be, So would you say it was too coincidental, like when he was passed away, and how exactly did he pass away?
Well, his obituary reads that he passed away from septic shock, and we don't know in what circumstances that occurred. And I believe he was in his 40s at the time, and that occurred in 1992. So that was about 3-4 years after the Finders incident. But it was about a year before this DOJ inquiry took place. We do know that he was no longer employed by the Washington Metro Police Department at the time of his death, and that he was working as a security guard for an embassy in DC. So it appears that by the time he did die, he had, how do you want to say it? He had taken a step down in terms of career roles. And I think that that's pretty common in somebody who goes against the established kind of narrative in departments and agencies like the FBI, the CIA, or police departments. So I wouldn't say, there's no evidence that he was killed or that there was something fishy about his death, but it does mean that we can't answer the question of, is Martinez recounting what he said correctly, and was Stitcher telling Martinez correctly that the CIA interfered? So
so we can only speculate. But yeah, like you said, there's no definitive evidence that it was something that he was killed or anything. And what I want to ask now is, for how long in the U.S. do you think that there were cults like this that existed? Have you seen evidence of these kind of cults existing since the inception of our intelligence agencies, or what would you say?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think that there have been allegations of similar types of activities in different areas in the United States, but also internationally. I mean, there are intelligence-linked child abuse scandals in the UK. There was the Franklin scandal in the same general time period, based in Omaha, Nebraska, where there were allegations of ritualistic abuse, but also specifically there were allegations of intelligence ties to that scandal. I would say it's the farther back you get, in some ways, the harder it is to really, document whether or not those types of things were taking place. But I would say that in general, when it comes to intelligence or the military and state, instruments of power, that we know that the CIA and other intelligence agencies have had no qualms in terms of assassinations, in terms of, being involved in gun running and drug running. it seems to me that when you have that level of power and that, a complete lack of checks and balances on your behavior, that any type of act that would increase your leverage and increase your power is something that would not be hesitated in terms of doing. So I don't think it's all that beyond the pale to think that intelligence agencies would be, linked to things like child pornography, child trafficking, because those things, can be related to blackmail. They can be related to things that give you serious political leverage. So I think that that's pretty reasonable and logical as an assessment. But in terms of specific rings, I mean, there are a few that come to mind. But I also think that the allegations in terms of the finders of, that were tied more to the satanic panic issue, I think that those really distracted from the intelligence links in this case. And I think that they served to kind of help dismiss the whole issue when that became really debatable. And there were a few other cases in that era that basically were blown up out of proportion, I would argue, and that allowed other really interesting and serious links with power, with intelligence, to go undocumented and not seriously reported on once the kind of furor around the satanic issue had died down.
Yeah. So we're talking about a case that happened in the 80s and in the early 90s. But for people who don't know, Elizabeth, the reason for why you are covering this so deeply now, despite this being a case from the late 80s, is because, number one, we shouldn't forget about something like this that happened. And number two, more information about this was released with the 2019 WikiLeaks Vault 7 documents, correct?
I mean, it wasn't WikiLeaks, it was the FBI.
Okay.
But
FBI, okay.
WikiLeaks has published a number of things that related to, like, for example, there was a Dutroux scandal in Belgium. They did publish a dossier related to that. But the FBI published the Vault documents. And what those are, they're FOIA documents. And so basically when the FBI gets a lot of FOIAs on one subject, they will at times just round up all the FOIAs that they've given to individual journalists or private citizens, and they'll publish them in one spot so that they're easily referenceable. And I would argue that, if there is a cover-up of the finders, I would argue that these documents serve superficially to debunk Ramon Martinez's allegations in his customs documents. However, what a lot of my work is focused on doing is looking deeper at those documents and showing that they actually substantiate really important claims that he makes, and that ultimately I found Ramon Martinez's allegations to be credible in terms of trusting that he had not fabricated anything that we can corroborate. There are things that we can't corroborate, thanks to not only Sergeant Stitcher's death, but also the fact that the Washington Metro Police Department never cataloged evidence properly when it came to the evidence that they gathered in D.C., which is where Martinez's really crucial and explosive allegations come in. That's what we don't have. We don't have photographs of the evidence. We don't have records that describe the evidence. We have very brief affidavits from the records of the search warrants, but all they say are things like assorted documents, photographs, a computer. They don't tell us what's on the computer. They don't tell us what the documents state. They don't tell us what the photographs portray. So basically, we're left unable to debunk or ultimately confirm Martinez, but I believe that ultimately he's a credible witness.
Yeah, and was this a case that you were already following prior to the FBI 2019 documents? What exactly motivated you to start covering this story?
Sure. Well, I found the customs memos online around 2017, and a former colleague of mine and I contacted Martinez ourselves at that time to confirm that these were real documents that he had authored and that they weren't just some kind of spoof, because they are so explosive and they are so dramatic in what they describe. And so we were able to get in contact with him and confirm that he had authored the documents and that they were genuine. But we talked to him for about an hour, but he was unwilling and is still very unwilling to go on the record. And so at the time, we felt that we couldn't cover it. And I basically decided, well, until something else comes out about this, or until Ramon Martinez changes his mind, I can't write anything. So, fast forward a couple of years, Jeffrey Epstein dies. And within a few, basically a lot of public consciousness is raised about allegations of powerful abusers of children and sex trafficking and that issue. And shortly after that, within a few months of that death, you have the FBI publish these Vault documents. And I started to work on something reporting on that when the first set were released, but they didn't publish everything at once. They published a first set of documents, then a second and a third over the ensuing months. And so I took a wait and see approach just to see how many documents they would ultimately publish. And once it seemed like they had really stopped for good, that's when I decided to write about it.
And are there any remnants of this group that you've seen evidence of still existing today, or is it completely disbanded?
That it's really hard to pinpoint a concrete answer to that. Some Finders members are still out there, but what I would say that from what I understand, they're not involved with the group now. But there are also allegations that the group basically morphed and took up residence elsewhere. I mean, there are some allegations that they went to Asia, some allegations that they went elsewhere. It's really difficult to know for sure. Now that the group's narrative was that they disbanded immediately. That is, I would argue that they did not immediately disband, and if they did kind of go underground, maybe they have different membership now, and maybe they operate a little bit differently. But I doubt ultimately that the Finders as a group are a one-off. I think that this type of thing continues, but we will probably not see, a glimpse of that now, because I feel that any operation, so to speak, that are of this nature, that are that explosive, that could embarrass an intelligence agency that much, would be much better protected from revelation. So I think that this is something we won't see again, but it gives us a little bit of a glimpse into kind of the really heinous activity that our intelligence agencies are capable of either supporting or being involved with.
So around the same time as this, there was the Franklin prostitution ring allegations that began in 1988 in Omaha, Nebraska. Do you think that this has any connection at all with the Finders case?
Well, I have not found concrete connections at this time between those two scandals. However, John DeCamp, who was a Nebraska state senator who is now passed away, wrote a book on the Franklin scandal called the Franklin CoverUp. And he was quoted at a question and answer session alleging exactly that there was a tie between the two groups. And he also said that former CIA had contacted him because they were upset about the CIA's involvement in the Finders, and that they had told him that the CIA had been involved with the Finders and that they had been, quote unquote, indoctrinating children, that it was to do with, training or quote unquote mind control, that type of thing. So there are allegations to that effect of a connection, but nothing concrete that where I can substantiate John DeCamp's allegations. And unfortunately, he's passed away, so we can't ask him further about that.
Right. Yeah, I was listening to your interview with Manar Mahawish of Mint Press News, and I remember you guys talking about Vice News and how they were just repeating the narrative that the authorities set about the Finders case. And it's just pretty consistent with a lot of their track record when it comes to some issues like foreign policy. And then with the Jeffrey Epstein case, not just them, but mainstream news in general was downplaying this issue. And now people, like, if you try to dig too deep into cases like this, they call us conspiracy theorists or pizza gators. So I just want to know if you know anything about the way that Vice News operates, and what your thoughts are on how mainstream news tries to downplay cases like this.
Sure. Yeah, I think you also see that in. I think you mentioned Epstein. Definitely, we see the same pattern when it comes to downplaying the establishment position of somebody like a Jeff Epstein, or especially the intelligence relationship that he had, multiple intelligence relationships, whether it's with the CIA or Israeli intelligence. I think that basically a lot of the mainstream media, Vice included, function as apologists for not just the establishment in terms of the corporations that run them, but also our states, our branches of government, whether that's intelligence or other aspects of it. So I would say that basically any story that embarrasses the intelligence community, any story that embarrasses very powerful institutions and corporate figures, and which are all, to an extent interrelated, that type of investigation, that type of narrative is much downplayed by the media. It is not just downplayed, it is spun in such a way that anyone who does raise that type of issue is called alt-right, conspiracy theorist, or basically called insane. I think it's really it's been heartening that the people that have reached out to me for interviews on this subject, and obviously the Mint Press, which has published my work on this, none of these outlets and none of the people I've spoken to have been alt-right. It's all been independent left-wing media that has been really open-minded and critical of power, but in a way that I think is really irreproachable and fact-based and very what do you want to say, like measured. It's not, we're not trying to sensationalize anything. I'm not trying to, spin a narrative out of nowhere. In fact, when you have 4,300 words of just trying to parse through 600 pages of documents, it's very difficult to spin a narrative from that. And so I think that anyone who, has been only familiar with the Vice or the corporate media spin on these subjects, just take a look at the documents yourself, because they really do speak for themselves, but look at them carefully. So.
Yeah, it's strictly just documents that you're citing and connecting the dots. It's objective analysis. It's at the minimum you have your opinions there, right? And I mean that's the best kind of independent media. That's the best kind of news that people can give, is have trust in the audience members in figuring things out, and by just presenting to people objective analysis and have them like connect the dots. I do want to just ask about the children who were involved. Like their what were their testimonies, and where are they now? Are they dealing with any trauma, or do they want to speak on the case at all now?
Well, I've heard some things off the record that I can't share here, but I would just like to say that basically, from what I understand, that they are out there. They have not come forward at this time, and I would definitely hesitate in the strongest terms. I would hesitate to ever put out a narrative there for them. I think that we should really allow them space to come out with whatever they experienced, and I can't speak to that. So I definitely don't want to do that for them. And I think that's one reason that the work that I have done has focused solely, as much as possible, on the documentation we do have, and especially what Martinez stated, which is in many ways separate to the experiences of the children in Tallahassee. Also, it is worth remembering that these children were very young when this happened, and that the finders were their biological parents and the people raising them. So this is not a situation like with an Epstein or even in Franklin, where a lot of the children in those situations were teenagers or pubescent children. They were not in the toddler stage. They weren't infants. And so their ability to form memories was a lot more refined by that point. And most of them were not family members of the people abusing them. They were lured in various ways. So in that sense, The Finders is a very unique story. And I think that affects the story in a lot of different ways. But as I've said in my writing and as I've said in interviews, the fact that we don't have witnesses in terms of victims who have come forward is something that is a major hole, so to speak, in the story. And it's one reason that I think, in a valid way, most independent journalists have been unwilling to cover this. But I think that despite that, we have enough documentation in terms of these records from the FBI and from Martinez to ask really important questions nonetheless, specifically about the intelligence links with this group.
So thanks to independent journalists like yourself, people are becoming more conscious about U.S. imperialism and how they oppress the people now, how there's corporations that buy off politicians, and that's why we can't really get any progress in this country. And we can't really get things to work for the people. Instead, they work for corporations. People are now aware of the problems of the country and what they do in other countries. And what would you say is the reason for why this case here is important, or cases like this are important for people to keep in mind when they start thinking about solutions and the path forward?
I think that there's a few really important takeaways from a story like this. One of them is that if your government and institutions of power are committing or in any way involved with committing these types of abuses against children, trafficking children, or anything like that, you've got a situation where your institutions of power are at a fundamental level illegitimate. And that goes right along with, in parallel, the other examples of the illegitimate use of power that we have, whether it's the endless wars, mass surveillance, the list goes on. I think that's a huge takeaway. As far as what we can do, in terms of stories like this, I think it's very important to talk about them, because I think that helping raise these types of conversations and people may argue against this, but I think that it's transformative in and of itself. And I think that while I can't prescribe a solution, I think that the absolute first step is to discuss not just this story, but stories like this that show kind of the collective shadow of our country.
So where else can people find more information about the Finders case? So you have your series that people can read on Mint Press News. Are there any documentaries or books that are written about them? Where else can people find information?
Sure, there are a few journalists who have covered this. Derek Burrows of the Conscious Resistance has done a documentary published in early 2019, and in that he has and on the Conscious Resistance you can find a interview that he did with a Finders member named Toby Terrell, which is interesting. Which both the documentary and that interview I think are worth watching. There's also journalist Nick Bryant, who covered the Franklin scandal and wrote an amazing book called, I believe, the Franklin CoverUp. It's called the Franklin Scandal. Excuse me. And he's a great resource. He was basically only willing to look at the Franklin scandal after having looked at these customs records for Martinez. And there are a number of other independent journalists out there who have covered this. And I hope that more will in the future.
All right, Elizabeth Voss, contributor of Mint Press News and Consortium News, co-host of CN Live, and a deep investigator of this story, the Finders case. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you again for having me.
Awesome. And everybody else, don't forget to stay informed.